So today I'm going to be talking about spring tonics and in general, kind of the practice of using spring tonics and the process of, or the concept of cleansing or detoxifying, which you will encounter a lot, which you're likely to encounter frequently if you read a lot about herbal medicine or talk to people who use herbal medicine. And it's kind of a misunderstood and culturally and scientifically fraught topic. So I'm going to try and do my best to make sense of all that. So generally speaking, broadly speaking, cleansing or detoxifying refers to using herbs or other practices to help the body get rid of toxic substances, including waste products, which are produced by the body, and exotoxins or external toxic substances, which are encountered in the environment. And the body has multiple different ways of doing this, but they can kind of be categorized into the categories of elimination and metabolism. Metabolism is when you break something down into a different substance or add to it and make it a different substance. But anyway, a chemical change to the substance is metabolism, and elimination is when it is removed from the body by way of the kidneys, the liver, the skin sometimes, the breathing sometimes, the colon. So herbs and other things that activate those organs are a big part of what people use in the process.
Based on my reporting, when I come home and it's
Sorry. Okay. So herbs that work on those processes are a big part of what people are talking about when they're talking about cleansing or detoxifying. And in addition to that, there are also things that in which, and this is, a lot of this is conducted by the same organs, where rather than just being removed from the body, some chemical change is made to a substance that makes it into something harmless or even sometimes reusable in a different form. So sometimes you'll hear people who are not from the world of herbal medicine or who are maybe coming from an academic and biomedical point of view saying, you know, there is no such thing as cleansing. All you have to do to cleanse is have a liver and kidneys and go about your life. And that's kind of really a sort of ableist and short-sighted view of things, because not everyone has a liver and kidneys that works perfectly. And, you know, even if they did, that would not necessarily cover all possible scenarios. So the idea of helping these organs out is actually very much a part of conventional medicine. You know, there are diuretics that work on the kidneys. There are things like statins that change how the liver is doing what it does. And these are doing that with the intention of removing substances from the body that can cause harm. But they don't think of it in those terms. And because they may have been sort of taught that their terms are the only terms, or that their way of describing things is some sort of absolute truth rather than just a model for understanding, they'll sometimes, you know, take this sort of smarmy approach that, you know, that there is no such thing because that's not how we talk about it. But they don't even think it's not how they talk about it. They just think that it doesn't exist because just because they don't talk about it. So anyway, that's something you might encounter as an herbalist, an attitude that you might encounter, that there is no such thing, or that nothing really helps the body cleanse. But it's really, it's not even true in conventional medicine. It's just not how things are described in conventional medicine. So it's really more of a cultural difference than anything else. But people from the dominant culture often don't realize that their culture is a culture. They just think it's the way things really are. And so that's something that certainly shows up in that situation. So in spite of that, people all over the world, have used different things for helping to purify the body, helping to detoxify, various different processes. Maybe it's called cleansing, or there's different ways of describing it in different places and different traditions. But they're all doing kind of the same, or a lot of them are doing this sort of the same thing in terms of making the organs of elimination and metabolism do their job in a different way, or in a more supported way. And springtime is often a time when people will do a once a year cleanse. A lot of the time, traditionally, people don't eat as well in the winter. Maybe they don't eat as much fresh food. Maybe more things like, nowadays it would be canned or frozen food. In previous times, it might be salted or smoked foods. But for a long time, people have had various different techniques of saving up food. And the winter time has often been a time when people would eat food that was saved up in one form or another, and also maybe have other stresses and other sources of exposure, like being around wood smoke more and that sort of thing. So throughout the world, you'll find different processes where, when springtime comes, people are trying to sort of undo the stress and damage that does to the body, and sort of purify and tonify the body in preparation for being more physically active, and in taking advantage of the fact that there are more fresh herbs, greens, medicines, and foods out there in the world once springtime comes. So the remedies that people use for this are sometimes described as spring tonics. That's a popular term where I live, and I think has been used throughout the English-speaking world quite a bit. So I'm going to talk about some of what spring tonics consist of and what they might be doing in the body. And then I'm going to go into some specifics, some details about a couple of specific herbs that are used in spring tonics. So one of the things that spring tonics are trying to do is move the fluids in the body. That's kind of the most essential thing that would be necessary, though not necessarily sufficient, but always necessary for there to be any sort of purification, cleansing, purging, anything like that. It's going to involve the movement of fluids in the body. And as such, spring tonics are usually in liquid form, and they often are taken with a lot of other fluids as well. And they might have actions like being laxative or being diuretic. They might also be bitter and choleretic, meaning that they're causing the liver to produce more of its juices. And there are a lot of herbs that fit the bill for those things that are growing right now, that are coming up in the temperate zones of the world when it's springtime. And where I live, it's springtime right now. Further north, it might not be yet. Some people think of March 21st as being the first day of spring equinox. Where I live, it's really not. Spring really begins in February where I live. And by the time March is here, you're kind of in full swing of it. And right now, well, by the time May rolls around, it's pretty much summertime. So March, it would be, maybe more accurate in my environment to think of March 21st as being about the middle of spring, of spring equinox as being about the middle of spring. In some parts of the world, spring equinox is considered the new year. It's Persian New Year, and that applies not only to Persia or Iran itself, but to a lot of areas that used to be part of or have been strongly culturally influenced by the Persian Empire. So that's, there's also traditions relating to that are relevant to spring tonics and cleansing as well. So if you look at what's going on in the world, in the spring world of nature right now, you see that there's a lot of greens coming up, and a lot of the winter annuals, the plants that I've talked about several times before that put out leaves during the winter time and then flower when it becomes spring, they're starting to bloom and be done. So some of them are coming into seed, some of them are in flower right now. And a lot of those herbs are edible and bitter greens, edible, maybe slightly bitter greens. Dandelion would be sort of the most obvious and abundant example, familiar and widely available. Dandelion leaves right now are small and they are somewhat bitter, but not very bitter. They're a little bit sour, a little bit bitter. As they get larger, they get more of the bitter latex in them and they become more strongly bitter. The sour stuff in dandelion works on the kidneys. The bitter stuff in it works on the liver. It causes the juices to flow through both of these organs. And so a lot of dandelion greens in a salad is a form of spring tonic as well. It's something that you can eat. You can make tea out of dandelion leaves. A lot of people don't really like it. The root is also harvestable just before the plant is going into flower. Once it's gone to flower, the root kind of loses a lot of its, once it starts putting up the flowering stem, the root starts to lose some of its energy, some of its starches, some of the calories that are in it and so forth. But it's harvestable because not all dandelions are in the same stage of growth all at the same time. So it's possible to harvest dandelion root throughout the year, pretty much in here in Kentucky anyway, and through a good 3/4 of the year in most of the places where it grows. And you can slice that root up, and here in Kentucky, a traditional way of using that is to slice the root up and roast it, cook it in the oven until the starches turn sort of brown. And then, so it starts out white, it will turn a rich, dark brown color when it's roasted. When it's just, if it's like sliced thin, spread out on a cookie sheet, put in the oven at 350 degrees or so for about half an hour, it will get browned somewhat. And then that can be, you can let that finish drying if it's not all the way dry, and use that to brew a drink, which people call dandelion coffee. You can do the same with chicory. Sometimes people add it to actual coffee. Sometimes people brew it by itself, but it's sweet and bitter, and it's laxative, and it's stimulating to the liver. So that's another type of spring tonic that's pretty traditional and still used, and easy to come by, good thing to prepare yourself, not too difficult. If you want to make something that's a little more involved than just a simple tincture or tea, it's, you know, got a few extra processes of preparation of the herb to change its properties a little bit and change its flavor as well. And so that's a good thing to try out. So dandelion is a good example of something that's a spring tonic that's available right now. Another one that I've mentioned a couple weeks ago is sassafrass. I'm going to talk more about sassafrass in a few minutes, but it's the bark of a tree, and it's kind of a very strongly culturally significant tree here in Kentucky and in Appalachia in general. It's got a very sweet aromatic flavor to it, and sassafras tea is not an all the time thing. It's like a seasonal treat, basically. Although you can keep the root or the bark and store them and use it any time of the year. But often it's just the bark being peeled this time of year before the leaves come out, sometime between Valentine's Day and when the leaves are fully out on the tree. The sap will be running all that time and the bark peels off easily. So that can that's something that people often use as a spring tonic. And it does not cause a lot of diarrhea. It does not cause a lot of increased frequency of urination. It does cause a general feeling of well-being, and it does seem to help the liver to metabolize some substances, and has a, you know, as people here would describe it as a blood purifying effect. But really, the liver is actually doing the purifying of the blood, and the sassafras is supporting and nurturing the liver. So that's another example of a spring tonic. There are a lot of bitter herbs growing, bitter and pungent herbs that are growing right now. Cresses, creasy greens, wild mustards of various different sorts that are coming up right now, all of which have the pungency and the spiciness helps to open the blood vessels some. They contain a lot of electrolytes, so they're helping the blood move through the body, and that is another way of helping with the sort of cleansing, detoxifying process, just getting the fluids to move through the body so that the fluids are moving through the liver, the kidneys, the spleen, and all the other organs as well, and kind of taking away waste products and helping the body to process them. At the same time that this is going on, another significant event that's happening in the plant world right now in early spring is tree pollen. And here in Lexington and in Kentucky in general, we had a lot of trees come down last week. There was a lot of wind, and one of the most significant destructive events in the last generation or so took place, where thousands of trees got blown over. And if you look at any of those trees, if you have some of them laying around in your neighborhood or in your yard or on your house or car or whatever, you might notice that a lot of them actually have small flowers on them, maybe leaves that are just starting to open up, and maybe small inconspicuous flowering structures. And those are producing pollen. And so spring tree pollen is wind pollinated. It's mostly not distributed by bugs, depends on the tree. But for most of them, it's not distributed by insects, it's distributed by the wind. And in order for wind pollination to be successful, the trees have to make absolute clouds of pollen. So, you know, sometimes you'll go out in the morning and your car will have a yellowish tinge to it. And if you touch it, you know, it gets on your fingers. So that's highly allergenic. It's very inflammatory, and it's all out there in the world right now. And that's happening every year at the same time, wherever you are, whether you're here and it's happening now, whether you're further north and it's happening a few weeks from now, or whether you're further south and it's already taken place. That's always happening at the same time as a lot of these winter annuals are flowering. And for a lot of people, not for everybody, but for a lot of people, that is a real inflammatory event. It's a real something that causes a lot of allergies. And even if you're not allergic to tree pollen, the just sheer presence of it as particulate matter in the air can be irritating to the eyes and the nose and throat. And so it can cause inflammation and irritation just by being particles, or it can trigger an immune response, which is an allergy. And so there's a lot of that happening at the same time that it's the time for spring tonics. So some of the things that have traditionally been used are also helpful for the allergies. They're also going to contain some anti-inflammatory substances. And often those anti-inflammatory substances that are in spring tonics are what are called phytosterols. And phytosterols are essentially steroids that are found in plants. And a lot of them are present in some of them, like beta-sitosterol is probably the most common one, are present in small amounts in most plants, or maybe not most, but in a lot of plants, seemingly most flowering plants, but in a wide variety of plants in small amounts. So, eating greens again, eating more fresh plant food again helps with inflammation, partly because of those things being there, and partly because of antioxidants, which are also very common in plants. But some of the bitter tonics contain larger amounts of them. Some of the bitter herbs like burdock and chicory and sarsaparilla, which is not very bitter, but it's slightly bitter, they contain larger amounts of these plant steroids that can have an anti-inflammatory effect and can also somewhat be soothing to the respiratory system when it's under assault from all this particulate matter and allergens. So some of the things that you can expect to be present in just about any process or remedy that's intended to be detoxifying, and some things that you should try to include strategically in any sort of detoxifying blend that you might make yourself, would be things that help to support the liver, things that help to support the kidneys. So the liver often goes with a bitter taste. Kidneys often go with a sour taste, sometimes a sweetish sour taste. Things that help to move the blood, and that often goes with a pungent or spicy kind of taste. And things that help to move the bowels, which often has more of a sort of a thick, sticky feeling to them, or maybe not a whole lot of strong taste, but a slightly sweet taste to them, and sometimes a bitter taste as well. So there are a lot of plants that help move the bowels for different reasons, and some of them are bitter and some of them are just sort of carby. So those things should be present in just about any kind of spring tonic, and some things that are anti-inflammatory, which might be the same as the previously mentioned herbs. So there'll be things that do each of those things in a lot of different spring tonics. Some of the spring tonics that are traditionally used in the folk medicine here in Kentucky are a bit extreme, because there is sort of a tradition here of using remedies that are dramatic and that get very noticeable results right away, which is something that is not so much what I usually tend to do when I'm trying to help people be healthier. But it is something that is very much a common practice in the folk medicine of Kentucky. So an example of that that's relevant here might be the root of mayapple. Mayapple is also known as American mandrake. It's a common plant in the woods here. It doesn't grow in fields and open spaces. It grows under the shade of trees. It's a really interesting plant when it starts coming up because it looks like a tiny egg, and then the egg sort of opens up into an umbrella-shaped leaf. And in the bigger plants, there will be two umbrella-shaped leaves that come to a forked branch, and then a stem below that, and a flower will bloom on that forked branch. The plant forms big networks of roots. You can often find a stand of it that's, maybe 50 by 200 feet, or maybe not quite that big, but a big stand of it, and they'll all be connected by the roots. They'll all be the genetically identical plants connected through their underground parts. Now, this plant is very bitter and it's somewhat poisonous, and it's not something that I recommend that you try using as an internal medicine until you're very experienced with working with people in general. And don't ever use it on anybody until after you've used it on yourself, so you know what it's like. But in general, it's something to stay away from. But it is something that is traditionally used as a laxative in Appalachian traditional medicine. And in larger amounts, it can actually make people throw up too. But in small amounts, it's a very powerful laxative. It makes the liver produce lots and lots of bile, and that bile just kind of flushes everything before it as it goes through you. And so people get watery, green discharges from their bowels. And sometimes that has been used as a cleanse, and it certainly makes people feel cleared out, but it is a little bit toxic itself, and it's just kind of, in my opinion, overworking the liver a little bit. I have used this plant internally some, but I don't very much, just because of the intensity of it, and usually there are milder things that I can use that will do whatever it is that I want from it. But using something like that, maybe along, or sometimes tobacco as an internal medicine, which is just a very violent purge, makes people throw up, makes people have diarrhea. So both of those are pretty traditional here. Both of those are, things that people that I talk to sometimes have grown up with as a remedy and or punishment. And they're pretty severe, and I don't really recommend using anything that dramatic. And a lot of the time when you look at cleanses that people are selling online, or that people are promoting as part of some sort of program that they're selling or whatever, sometimes they're very harsh and dramatic, and that's, I feel, not really necessary. There was one that was popular in the 90s, and there were different variations on this where people would drink like a cup of olive oil, and then they would drink some lemon juice and things like that. And it was supposed to be removing gallstones from your body, but probably a lot of the time it was just kind of creating things that looked like gallstones out of all the fat and acid that you were swallowing. It certainly did make people have movement through their body of fluids, make people move their bowels and things like that. But it was often painful, and it was questionably of any utility. It might have just been putting more strain on the body. But for a long time, a lot of people did it and loved it because they felt like it was a powerful cleanse that, they could see the results of, that they could feel a difference from. And I would rather have something that just kind of subtly makes a difference over the course of a few days or a week or something like that, rather than something that causes like a dramatic, sudden purge. I really don't believe that is hardly ever the way to do things. So sometimes that's an approach where I differ from some traditions of natural medicine and plant medicine. And so it's yeah, in my opinion, usually a good idea for people to be able to feel a difference, but not have that difference be something where their life is strongly disrupted by it. So for instance, if you're eating dandelion greens and drinking sassafras tea as a spring tonic and as a cleanse, you'll notice a difference. You know, you'll need to pee more. You'll probably notice a difference in the way that your mood feels. You may notice a difference in the way that inflammation in your body feels, that sort of thing. But it won't be something that you have to miss work because of. It won't be something where you're not able to do what you were going to do at home because of. It's just, you know, something that fits into your life and increases the ability of your body to metabolize and eliminate toxins and waste products without necessarily causing any huge dramatic shift in how your body is working. Subtle, steady shifts are where it's at as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's my experience after working with people for decades, and not necessarily something that everybody does that way, but you know, and maybe dramatic effects would get more repeat customers. I don't know, but that's not really my goal. My goal is to have people live long, healthy lives, and so that's what I'm going for. So I want to talk specifically about two herbs this week, one of which is sassafras and the other of which is sarsaparilla. People often confuse the two of these herbs with each other because both of them have been used in making root beer, which I think I will also have a chance to tell you some about how I make root beer with them. And root beer is a type of spring tonic in its origin. So sassafras is part of the laurel family, and it's kind of you can sort of, when you taste it or smell it, you can notice some kinship both to bay laurel, which you might have used for cooking, and cinnamon. It has a sort of aromatic, sweet, slightly spicy flavor to it. Not really hot, but a little bit spicy. Warm, I guess, might be a better word for it. Some people say that it smells like bubble gum to them. I'm not really, it doesn't really to me. I think that it's kind of a different smell than that, but some people kind of feel like that's what it smells and tastes like. The bark and the root are used. The root is dug in the fall. The bark is harvested in the spring, fall or early winter for the root can be dug anytime after the leaves fall off, but before the sap starts running again. So in the fall, the plant brings all of its substances down into the root, brings a lot of its energy and essence down into the root, and stores it there for the winter. So if you were wanting to get it in the winter, fall, after the leaves have fallen, that's when you would get it. And then in the spring, here in Kentucky, usually the third week of February, pretty predictably, the sap starts running, and eventually the plant flowers and then leaves out. And during that time is when you would harvest the bark. And it's the whole thickness of the bark can be used medicinally. It's very aromatic. Usually, if I am harvesting sassafras, I'm usually harvesting smaller trees and taking the entire above ground part of the tree if I'm taking the bark. Because if you take the bark all the way around a tree, then the tree is going to die. If you take a panel of bark off of the trunk of a tree, then there's a good chance that the tree is going to die and you're not going to have taken as much bark from it. So if you were going to harvest from a large tree, you would want to take a whole branch and take all the bark off of that branch. There aren't that many large sassafras trees. It will get 60 feet tall and, you know, a few feet around if it's allowed to grow for 100 years. But a lot of the time it's a short-lived plant, and it's kind of an understory plant that's more like a small tree or a bush. So if you have something that's that size, that's maybe the thickness of a broom handle, and you just cut that off and then peel all the bark off of that tree. That's how beavers harvest bark. Porcupines harvest bark by eating the branch, by eating the bark, climbing up the tree and eating the bark off of a branch. So you can harvest it like a porcupine if you're really going to harvest from a larger tree, which I just generally don't with sassafras, for the very reason that there aren't that many of them and they take a long time to grow, but that works with other trees as well. So if you take the whole branch, that's how porcupines do it. If you take a whole tree, but fewer of the trees, then that's how beavers do it. Both beavers and porcupines have been harvesting bark for a long time now, and they're able to do it without generally over harvesting. Neither of them like sassafras, though. It's not good for rodents, and so they usually don't tend to eat it when there are other barks around. The flavor of it's maybe too strong for them or something, and their bodies aren't good at metabolizing it either. Which unfortunately led to a circumstance in which, after many centuries of humans using sassafras and sassafras becoming an economically important plant in Appalachia, it was pulled from the market because people found out that it caused cancer in lab rats when used in large amounts. And the metabolite that causes cancer in lab rats is hydroxysaffrol, which is not a metabolite that is typically produced in humans. The substance that is metabolized into it, saffrol, is present not only in sassafras, but in black pepper, saffron, which nobody really eats much saffron, but it's present in black pepper, it's present in holy basil, it's present in a whole lot of other substances that people eat. And so those weren't yanked off of the market, but sassafras was. And now a lot of the time, if you find a sassafras extract on the market, it's had the saffrol removed from it. And we usually say something to that effect on the label. And because the saffrol is removed from it, it's actually lost a lot of its medicinal properties. So sassafras, when you make it properly, if you make a decoction of sassafras, it's aromatic and it's also thick and viscous. It's not the texture of water or black tea. It's a little bit slimy. It's kind of thick and a bit slimy, and has a lot of body to it, a lot of viscosity to it. And that helps move, that viscosity is actually a matrix or a gel type arrangement of starches that have been intermixed with water. And that matrix of carbohydrates helps to absorb stuff out of the body, helps to absorb water out of the body, and helps to soften the stools. And the warmth of it helps to increase the warm spiciness of it. Helps to increase the flow of the blood to the lining of the digestive system and producing more digestive juices. So it's actually good for increasing appetite, increasing digestion and absorption of things, but it's also adsorptive. So if the body is trying to get rid of waste products through the colon, they'll go into this matrix of gel and be carried out of the body by it through the bowels. So it's that's part of the healing property of sassafras. In addition to that, the slight bitterness of it seems to work on the liver, and it also has some effects on the mood and on the nervous system and the endocrine system through probably some of the plant sterols it contains, as well as the saffrol. And taken all together, as one does, taken as a whole plant extract, that tends to make people feel a bit uplifted. Some people report increased libido from it. Some people feel less tired from it. Some people laugh more or feel happier. Some people feel more like cuddly and that sort of thing from it. So it has some mild mood altering, mood elevating, mood supporting type of properties, kind of like basil does, but also a little bit different. It may cause some weird feeling, kind of high or euphoric type feelings if taken in large enough quantities, but it's hard for me to sort that out because the only way I've ever seen people take it in very large quantities is in the form of an alcoholic beverage, and then you've got the alcohol along with it, which, you know, really kind of makes it hard to tell if what you're seeing is just the alcohol or whether it's something else. But in normal doses, sassafras tea is very uplifting. A lot of people use it as remedy for grief and depression, seasonal winter depression type stuff. And it's pretty good for that. It's pretty helpful for a lot of people. So it's a good herb to know about. It's really not a commercial herb. You can order bulk sassafras as just a raw plant material, but it's not really used much as far as being an ingredient in things or as an extract or any sort of finished product because of the fact that it was associated with negative outcomes in rodents, which traditionally it's also used to keep rodents from getting into your things that you're trying to store. So, you know, the fact that it's not good for rodents was something that people knew before the laboratory experiments, but then once those experiments were conducted, it kind of became associated with it in a negative way and no longer available as a commercial thing. Hang on just a second. So does it blend well with Tulsi? Yes, they blend well together. They taste similar in some ways, or they have some overlapping notes in their flavor. And I've definitely used them before. And there was a question of what counts as a normal dose. Well, when I said a normal dose, I meant like 1 to 3 cups of tea a day, something like that. It has not been known to actually cause cancer in humans, and from what we know of it, the metabolite that's responsible for the irregular cells in the laboratory animals is not a metabolite that's produced in humans. So basically, in rodents, it becomes toxic after it's been digested in a way that it doesn't, as far as we know, in people. So no, it's pretty safe. Seemingly, there haven't actually been like real life problems associated with it. It's just kind of like the theoretical problems that people imagined for it were spooky enough that they felt like they had to do something about it. And I think that if at the time, if the people who had been harvesting and selling sassafras had been, you know, something like a wealthy industrial organization like what the Dairy Council or Beef Council is, that it wouldn't have happened. But because it wasn't something that was being run by people with a lot of lawyers or anything like that, it was just, you know, mountain people, that kind of thing got passed in a way that it otherwise might not have, or that kind of, it didn't actually get passed. It was just sort of a decree by the FDA. But that sort of regulation got made that probably wouldn't have if there had been a little more clout behind the people making sassafras. But yeah, it's not really something that's been associated in real life with a lot of problems. Is there concern in drinking a lot of it? Not really. I mean, it may, in large enough doses, make people feel kind of weird. Maybe make people feel I'm not exactly sure what, but something other than a normal state of consciousness, like I guess you could say feel high or something like that. But it would take a lot of it. I've had a quart of sassafras over the course of a day many times and never felt anything uh unusual or drug-like from it. I could tell the difference. It didn't make me feel good, but it didn't make me feel you know, anything other than just like a natural, normal, good feeling. So yeah, sassafras is somewhat thick, viscous when you make it right. And when I say make it right, uh, I mean make a decoction of it, a strong decoction of it, with maybe um, one part of sassafras to 4 parts of water or so, and then let that sit overnight. Simmer it for 20 minutes and then let it sit overnight.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? 1 part herb to what?
About 1 part herb to 4 parts water, and then simmer that for 20 minutes and then let it steep overnight. At the end of the 20 minutes, you'll have like an orange liquid, orangish reddish liquid that's a little bit full bodied. And then by the next morning, it will actually be much thicker and more viscous and slippery feeling between your fingers and that sort of thing. So it just takes a while for the starches in it that create that slippery feeling to come out of the bark and into the liquid.
Once it has set overnight, if you
Mhm.
enjoy drinking it warm, how would you go about? Do you just rewarm your little bit on the
Your
stovetop
portion of
or
it, yeah,
okay.
that's what I would
I didn't
do.
know if you would like add more water or add like another warm tea to it or whatever.
No, I usually just pour off what I'm going to use and keep it refrigerated and then warm up a cup as needed or as desired.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the other plant that I want to talk about today is sarsaparilla. And when I say sarsaparilla, I mean smilax, the genus Smilax, which here the usual 2 species are Smilax glauca and Smilax rotundifolia. There are lots of other species that grow throughout North America. What I do not mean is Aurelia racemosa or Aurelia nudicalis, which are plants that are more closely related to, they're in the same family as ginseng and ivy. And they're not really the same thing. And I don't know why people decided to give the same name to both of them, because they grow in the same woods together. It's not even a case of, people discovering a plant that reminded them of the plant in the old country, and so they gave it the same name. They both are native North American plants that grow in the same eastern mixed metaphysic woods together, and people just decided to call them the same things in English for no good reason. But Smilax is also sometimes called greenbrier or catbrier or sawbrier. It is a woody green vine that has thorns and sort of oblong leaves, oblong to sometimes vaguely heart-shaped leaves. And it's very common. It's a very common species in second growth forests, in forests that have been cut down and are growing back. And it often forms a sort of barrier. It grows from the ground and then grows up onto trees and between trees and things like that. So sometimes people trip over it as they're trying to walk through the underbrush. I've even seen someone get tangled up in it before. So it's kind of rope-like, but with thorns. So it's kind of like nature's barbed wire, I guess. It's woody and hard, and often forms, tangled masses. And like I said, very common. You find it in not only way out in the woods, but also parks here in town. Yes, smilax, not Aurelia, is what I'm talking about today. Aurelia is a wonderful plant, but it's not the one that I'm talking about right now. So when you dig up smilax, what you get is an underground version of what you see above ground. So it's actually more of an underground stem with little roots growing off of it than an actual large underground root. Sometimes when you dig it up, sometimes it is as white as bone. It's very pale, smooth, shiny. And because it reminded people of bone, and because it's long and straight like a spine, people sometimes have given it the name chineweed. Chine is like the backbone of an animal carcass in butchery terms. So kind of old butchery terms. I don't know if anybody really uses that term anymore, but it reminded people of a vertebral column, so it's called chineweed. It's very hard, tough to cut through. You can break through it with a shovel pretty easily, but you can't really cut it with scissors, or if you cut it with a knife, it can be kind of hard to cut with a knife, depending on the knife. But it's very hard, bony like material. And when it dries, it gets even harder. And of course, it's muddy and thorny. So washing the mud off of the thorns and prickles can be kind of hard. Some species, the glauca species, is less thorny, the underground part, than the rotundifolia species. But the nice thing about gathering it is you can gather a big basket full of it from one or two plants. So if you've got mature vines of this stuff growing, you can gather a lot of the underground part of it very easily. Often there will be a whole area that's connected, where there will be the vines coming up out of the ground in multiple places, and the underground stem, which is the part you're harvesting, the root system going along. It'll often be going along right below or right on the surface, like sometimes just under the leaf litter but on top of the dirt, or sometimes just barely down in the dirt. So you can pull it up and pull it up and pull it up for yards and yards, and then you can roll it up like an extension cord and wash it off and take it home and chop it up. It is kind of a beast to work with. It's because it's tough and prickly. And if you were to make it the way I just described, well, let's see. If you were to make it the way you make most decoctions, just by chopping it up, simmering it for 20 minutes, you would get something that looked a lot like hot water. And so it is actually the sort of thing where you probably want to let it simmer covered on low heat for an hour or so, and maybe add a little bit of water as you're going on to account for whatever might be going up in steam. But simmer it for maybe an hour or so, and then let it sit overnight. And you'll get, it actually turns sort of reddish color, and you get a thicker substance. It's full bodied, but it's not as slippery as sassafrass. But if you have a jar full of sarsaparilla root decoction made the way I just described, and you shake it, if you have a half full jar and you give it 2 shakes, the other half will be completely full of suds. So it's very foamy. And what makes it foamy is actually a type of steroid. Partly it's starches, but a lot of it is actually a type of steroid. And these substances are, they're called saponicides, and they are like naturally occurring soap molecules that have a steroid nucleus. So they act like a soap molecule in terms of forming suds. You could describe them as being foam fractionable, which means that if you blow water through the air, you'll eventually get them all to come out of the liquid as suds. In terms of everything I just said about their structure, they're similar to what's in ginseng. In some ways they're different, but they have tonic effects on the body that are like a much, much milder version of what ginseng does in terms of making people feel a little bit more energetic, maybe making people feel a little bit more libido, maybe making people feel a little bit less inflammation in their body. They're not necessarily super efficiently absorbed, so some of them just kind of pass through you. And because of their texture, they might make whatever else is in you pass through you along with them. So they're slightly laxative, but not dramatically at all. So people in Appalachia sometimes did actually make a decoction from them and then cook that down until it was a thick pudding-like substance and eat that. And it's mild enough that it can be eaten like that without causing any kind of problems. It doesn't give people roid rage or make them not able to sleep for days or anything like that. It's pretty mild. I have made that once, and it was a lot of work. But it was a recipe I wanted to try out. And that's really all there was to it, was just simmering it for an hour with the root, then letting it sit overnight, pouring it off from the root, straining it, and then cooking what was left down until it was very thick. And it took a long time and took a lot of plant material to make a small amount of finished product, but it is possible to do. And it used to be, sort of like I said, like a traditional dessert in the mountains, and probably in other places where this plant grew as well. Yeah, the root, well, I call it the root. It's really the root system. It's mainly the underground stem that has the actual roots that are growing off of the underground stem are about 1 inch long, and they're just little scraggly things. But the root system, the underground stem, the rhizome, whatever you want to call it, is long, the long white bone-like part of it. And that's the only part that's used. I don't use the above ground part for that. There are other parts of it that are eaten and stuff like that. But what I'm describing is just the underground part of it. The vine itself has little green tendrils that wrap around things as it's growing, and those can be eaten, and they're kind of like a nice little, I don't know, salad garnish type of thing. Sort of like fiddlehead ferns. They taste about the same, just a very green taste to them. So that's an interesting thing that can be foraged this time of year, and really can be foraged through much of the year. But this time of the year is when you can first start to find it doing that. You can find the plant all winter long, but it's putting out new growth. It's putting out new growth at this time of year. I'll be right back. All right, yeah, so medicinally, sarsaparilla is also considered a tonic or an alterative. It's a mild laxative, tends to increase people's sense of energy and overall feeling of well-being and decrease inflammation throughout the body. I often also have heard it, well, I've heard it described as a spleen or lymph tonic. I often will use it if someone has swollen lymph nodes, and usually, if they take it, their swelling in their lymph nodes will go down. So it's helping to move the fluid through the lymph system, which contains a lot of the fluid in the human body. So it's helping with that at the same time. And the lymph system moves waste products and fats and other things around through the body as well. So it's, part of the detoxifying and cleansing process. And sarsaparilla is kind of the first thing I reach for if I want to do something with the lymph system, if I'm wanting to help the lymph system and support it, nurture it. Sarsaparilla is pretty much the first thing that I tend to reach for. There are other things like poke root that are more dramatic. Poke contains some very powerful substances that move lymph through the lymph system and that are somewhat toxic. Poke is also growing right now as a spring green, and this is something that's traditionally eaten here, even in Lexington, not just in rural areas. People will gather poke leaves, and you have to cook them, pour the water off, cook them again. Some people change the water again after that. And then when they're thoroughly cooked and you've changed the water a couple times, you can eat them. And what that cooking and changing the water does is get rid of most of the alkaloids and saponins that are in the poke leaf. There's more of them in the root than there are in the leaf, but renders it safe to eat. And it does have something of a cleansing effect, which is sometimes pretty noticeable in terms of laxative effect. And it is, a very common spring green that's eaten for health purposes, as well as, being something that people think of as being, just good food that they like to get once a year or so. Nobody eats it very frequently, and it's mainly edible when it first starts coming up out of the ground. The root is the root of a full-size poke plant is maybe like the size of my forearm, maybe even bigger than that sometimes. So, which is probably, that amount of poke root is probably as much as you want to use. It would last you for years if you were to, it wouldn't necessarily keep for that many years, but it would theoretically be the quantity that you would use in the space of years of practice if you were to make a tincture out of one root of a full-size poke plant. So usually I just break a piece off and make a quart or so, which will last me for many months because I don't use it very much. And when I do use it, I use it in low doses. And that is a more strong cleansing remedy for the lymph system, but it is one that is also pretty well known and not super widely used, but somewhat widely used here in the traditional medicine of Kentucky. Hang on just a second. Yeah, it's a huge plant. It's when it's fully grown, sometimes it's 10 feet tall or more, and it has these vibrant magenta stems. The berries are dark purple. Birds eat them, and then their bird poop is bright purple. And the seeds are pretty toxic. The whole plant contains toxic substances, but it also does have a history of medicinal use. And fatalities from it are pretty much, I tried several years ago to find records of fatalities from it, and I couldn't actually find any. I found lots of records of people getting very sick from it, and some of them even being hospitalized and things like that, but not fatalities, strangely enough. So it really throws people out of balance, can make people lose consciousness, can make people dizzy and stuff like that. If you're even going to handle it, you should handle it carefully because it it is transdermal. It can get through your skin. I had one time the experience of wringing out some roots, trying to get all the juice out of them, and I had them in some cheesecloth, and I was pressing them through the cloth. And I was doing this without gloves or anything. This is fairly early on in my herbal career, and it made me feel pretty weird. And then I felt a little bit sick afterwards, So it was I felt sort of dizzy, and then I felt like mildly sick to my stomach afterwards. So it's it's something that even handling it does have the potential to have some noticeable effects, and yet it is something that people have used as a detoxifying, cleansing thing, partly because it contains a fairly innocuous, fairly short-lived toxin that the body dramatically responds to, and in so doing might eliminate that and other toxins that might be present. With any kind of cleansing, though, with any of this sort of thing, you have to be careful that you're not, if you're taking medications that you're relying on, you don't want to be cleansing those out of your system. So, that's something to be aware of as a possibility. If something is moving your bowels very strongly, moving contents of your stomach through your body very strongly, or if something is making your liver or your kidneys work a lot harder than usual, sometimes that will mean that medicines in your system might not last as long. And that goes for herbal medicines, other herbal medicines you might be taking, prescription medicines, whatever. So, it's important to be aware that what makes something a toxin is partly the fact that you don't want it to do what it's doing, and partly the fact that you're taking it at a large enough dose to do something that you don't want. So if you are doing anything to cleanse or detoxify, you want to take care that you're not doing it to such an extent or in such a nature that it's removing substances from your body that you might have put there on purpose. So I want to talk about root beer. I'm making root beer from roots specifically. This is something that I like to do this time of year, and it's a practice that I enjoy, and that I think is very old-fashioned and a little bit different, but a good thing for herbalists to know how to do. Herbal beers of different sorts and herbal brews like this have been used a lot throughout history. I talk a lot about making tinctures, which is a lot of what I use in my practice here. But tinctures, as we know them, have really only been common for about 1,000 years, which is that's a while, but it's a fairly short span of time in the history of people using herbal medicines. And previous to that, people might have been using things like wine, or sometimes brewing the herbs and letting them turn into something like wine or beer. So I want to talk a little bit about that type of process and what's going on there. And usually what happens is you start out with something that's just an herbal extract, an herbal tea, or an aqueous extract like a tea or a decoction. And then you would add to that some sort of sugar if there's not already something in it, and then some sort of starter, and then letting that work. So to give an example, nettle wine is a very common herbal wine that it's more of an old world thing, something people in England might make, for instance. People here would do it with dandelions sometimes. Dandelion wine is a very traditional Kentucky beverage. So I'm going to talk about some similarities and some differences between those two things, both of which are considered spring tonics, both of which stimulate the kidneys, and both of which contain some antioxidants and minerals and things like that. So with either one of them, you would start out with what is essentially an herbal infusion, a very strong tea. With nettles, you would just be doing that with the nettle leaf. With dandelions, you would actually be doing it with the dandelion flowers. And you would, people don't always measure this sort of thing real well, but it might be something like getting a gallon jug and loosely filling it with fresh nettle leaves, and then pouring boiling water over it and sealing it, or getting a gallon jug and filling it half to two-thirds of the way full with dandelion flowers, pouring the boiling water over it, and then covering it and letting it steep. In the case of the nettles, you'll get a dark colored, almost black liquid. And in the case of the dandelions, you'll get a bright yellow one. It's really lovely. Contains lots of lutein, which is a yellow antioxidant, something vaguely in the vitamin A, beta carotene type of family. And then with either of those, you would strain it. With dandelion, you don't actually have to add anything to it as far as a sugar, because it contains the nectar from the flower. It contains the sugars that were already present in the flower. With nettle, it doesn't really contain much along those lines. So you can add some kind of sugar to it. It doesn't have to be very much, depending on what you want the finished product to be like. But that sugar will ferment into alcohol if it is kept in a space where it's not in contact with a lot of air. So if you put it in a jug, if you put it in a completely sealed jug, it will ferment and it will shatter the jug because the fermentation process produces gases which produce pressure. So traditionally, people have gotten around that by trying to create something where gas can escape, but air can't get in. And there are a few different ways to go about that. Stopping the lid of the jug with a corn cob is a very imprecise way to do it. Cutting off a section of something like a rubber glove where you've cut off one of the fingers to allow an opening where gas can escape as it inflates, but that air won't be coming back in. It'll just be the gas coming out under pressure, is a slightly improved way to do that. A much nicer way to do it is to get a neoprene stopper with a hole in it and put a vapor lock in that hole, which is a little tube that has some water in it and a bend, kind of like the U-bend under a sink, and it'll allow the gases from the fermentation to bubble up without allowing water to get, or air to get down in it, or bugs or anything else like that. So, you know, all of those are different approaches. I've done the corn cob one, but most of the time I do the ripple lock, the bubble lock, which is, you know, something you'd have to buy. But with nettle, because it doesn't contain much sugars of its own, you'd have to add some source of sugars to it, which a lot of the time people would just mix beet sugar in with it and warm it up so that the beet sugar melts into it. And the more sugar, well, let's see. If you have a gallon of it and you add 2 cups of sugar, it'll eventually lose the sweetness and make a pretty strong finished product as far as how much alcohol is in it. If you sweeten it to the sweetness of grape juice, you'll end up with something about the strength of wine. If you sweeten it more than that, it's going to get very it's going to be very sugary even after it's finished. If you sweeten it less than that, it will not get as strong. So with the dandelion, you don't have to add sugar to it. With the nettle, you would have to add sugar to it, or else it will just kind of, it won't really ferment the way you want it to. But before you do that, or well, no, after you add the sugar, but before you seal it in the container, you want to add some kind of a starter to it, which is either a packet of yeast or some yeast, doesn't have to be a packet, but some active dry yeast, or some of the dregs from the previous batch of whatever you've been brewing. So if you go from one brewing project to the next, you don't ever actually have to buy yeast. You can just keep using the yeast from, or a little bit of the previous thing that you fermented. Doesn't work so well if you try to add, doesn't work as well if you try to add something that's been bottled or packaged or whatever, because it might not have any live yeast in it. But anyway, you let it, you add the starter or the yeast, you let it work for about 6 weeks to 2 months, and then you take it out of the container it's been fermenting in and pour it into bottles and seal them. And that's how you make herbal wines. If you want to make a beer, you could add less sugar and ferment it for a week or two. And at that point, it would still be fizzy, it would still be bubbly, and it wouldn't be nearly as strong in terms of the alcohol in it. Both approaches have been used probably way longer than people have been writing things down. Both approaches have been used for a really long time, and still are. There's a third approach, which is where you just let it start to froth and ferment over the course of about 24 hours or so, and then you bottle it up and you use it pretty soon. You cap it loosely. You don't put it in an airtight container because it will break the container, but you use it pretty soon. And then that is more along the lines of you could make kombucha that way if you used a kombucha starter. If you're just using yeast, you'll get something like a non-alcoholic beer, or, you know, I say non-alcoholic, there's trace amounts of alcohol, but very little. And so that's actually the way that I like to make ginger beer and root beer, is by making an infusion, or a decoction of those herbs, and making adding a little bit of something sweet to it. I use maple sugar, letting it come to a fermenting froth, and then straining it and using it as a non-alcoholic beverage. And, you know, kombucha is kind of the same thing, but it's got a sort of a combination of alcohol producing yeasts and vinegar producing stuff. So it, depending on how much air is getting to it, might be, you know, frothy, but not as not very alcoholic, more sour, that sort of thing. So with ginger beer, ginger ale, I would just make it with ginger. And, you know, you could let it ferment until it's like the full alcoholic strength of beer. I don't really like that, so I don't do it that way. I let it ferment overnight in a bowl, kind of an open thing, with just some cheesecloth over it to prevent bugs and stuff from getting into it, and then bottle that to be used the next day or over the next couple of days. And root beer is done the same way. With ginger ale, you'd be grating the ginger, get fresh ginger, grate it, make a decoction of that, and then make the fermented product out of that. With root beer, I'm doing it with sarsaparilla and sassafrass. The sassafrass gives it most of its flavor. Sarsaparilla gives it most of its foam. They both contain some flavor and some foam, but usually I make them in the same water. For instance, I would take a gallon of water and add maybe half a cup or a cup of sarsaparilla, and then let that simmer or make a decoction of that for about 40 minutes, and then add a cup of sassafras root or bark, and let that continue to simmer for another 20 minutes or so, and then let it sit overnight. So rather than making two separate decoctions and then combining them, I'm concocting them, I'm cooking them together. in the same liquid, and it makes a thicker, stronger finished product. And then once I strain that, I usually add maple syrup to it. I like the way it tastes. It goes kind of with the same thing, and they're all trees that grow, or well, they're all woody plants that grow in our forests. And then add the barm or the yeast to that, the starter to that, and let it start to ferment. And then after I've fermented it for a while, when I'm done fermenting it, I usually stick it in the fridge, and that will make the yeast fall down out of it. And I do that before I strain it and bottle it. So that is how you make root beer out of roots. And it's a real crowd pleaser. I serve it at parties and things like that. It's people really like it. You know, a lot of the time people are amazed that it tastes like root beer. But it's a good traditional beverage that is kind of a good spring tonic. It's cleansing, it's purifying, it's uplifting, and it tastes good. And it's not unfamiliar to people because they've had root beer flavor. They've just never had like actual root beer made from roots, you know. So it's kind of a, when people taste it, they usually kind of have the sense that they've had the imitation of it their whole life and that this is the real thing. And so a lot of the time people really like it for that reason. How long do I ferment it? I do it two different ways. One way is that I ferment it for about 12 to 24 hours. And the other way is that I ferment it, and that's when I do that way, I do it in an open mixing bowl with cheesecloth covering it for about 12 to 24 hours. And then I put it in the bottles and cork them, loosely cork them. So that if it continues fermenting, it'll pop the cork rather than shattering the bottle. So that's the way I do it if I want to make a non-alcoholic beverage, something that's kind of kid-friendly, not necessarily explicitly an adult beverage, or not necessarily something that people will get drunk from if they drink a lot of it. So I do it that way most of the time. The other way that I do it is to let it ferment for a couple weeks and then bottle it. And in that case, it's more strong. It's got some alcohol in it. It's less sweet and it has more alcohol in it. The amount of sweetness versus alcohol has to do with how strong the yeast is and how fast the yeast works. And that can be pretty variable from batch to batch. If you wanted consistent results, you could like use consistent yeast, like getting Red Star champagne yeast, for instance, and then using that and the same amount of it every time. But I don't usually do it that way. I usually pour in a little bit of the last batch of something else that I've been brewing, which right now is apple cider, hard cider. And so, you know, I'd use the last of the yeast from my hard cider and put that in the spring tonic. That's the fall fermented beverage. So this would be the spring fermented beverage. And then let that ferment for either a day or a couple weeks, depending on whether I wanted something more like a pop or something more like a beer. You know, I feel like the sweet taste actually kind of goes more nicely with this particular combination of herbs too, because they're so aromatic and fragrant and stuff. But different people like it different ways, and I've served it to people in both of those forms, even though the sweet one is my own preference. And so anyway, that's it's a somewhat more complicated recipe, but it's something that you know, at this stage in the game, I think you're more than adequately prepared for, and it's a good thing to try with plants that are out there right now, plants that you might be able to go out and forage if you live around here. Another thing that you can make that's a very traditional spring tonic that isn't so much something you would, well, it's more something that you could get from weedy fields all over the world rather than something that's more specific to the woods of Kentucky, which is dandelion and burdock. Dandelion and burdock was a popular combination as a drink in the early 1900s or so, when the temperance movement was very popular. They promoted this as sort of an alternative to things like beer and stout as a social beverage. And I think they kind of wanted something that tasted bad, but that wouldn't get you drunk. So that it would like replace the beer or whatever that people drank that usually tasted bad, but also caused intoxication. That's my view of it, but it's a rather bitter, it's a bitter and very earthy tasting beverage. It's not really that bad. It's very earthy tasting, and it's a very unusual taste to most of our palates, but it's made by making a decoction of burdock and whole dandelion, sliced burdock roots, and then the entire plant of dandelion, root, leaf, flower, and everything chopped up and thrown into the pot and made into a decoction, and then allowed to steep until cool. So like brought to a simmer for 15 minutes or so, and then allowed to steep until cool. And that can either be taken just as a straight warm beverage, or it can be fermented a little bit like the first way that I described, to make a non-alcoholic beverage. I suppose you could make an alcoholic burdock and dandelion, but the alcohol would be working at cross purposes with the liver tonic herbs in some ways. So it's not usually the way it's done. And like I said, it was, more of a popular beverage that was associated with an anti-alcohol movement that was popular in the late 1800s to first quarter of the 1900s. So yeah, dandelion and burdock. It's an interesting combination, very earthy and bitter, and I don't know. You can really feel it making the juices move from the time that you get it in your mouth, and it causes you to make more saliva, and then once it's in your stomach, it's making the stomach produce more juices, and so on all the way down. So that's an interesting and kind of a nutritive and detoxifying spring tonic that was this made out of plants that came over here from Eurasia. Would you blend anything with the dandelion flowers to be pleasant, like ginger? You could. You can do it however you want to. I haven't really done that. I haven't really made ginger and dandelion as a combination, but I definitely encourage anyone who wants to try things like that out. These are extremely well tolerated and versatile herbs that I encourage people to mix them together and see what kind of results you might get, and how they feel to you and that sort of thing. But it's not a combination that I've tried myself. It's not a combination that I've tried myself, but it does sound like, that it could be a nice thing. You get the blood moving and circulatory and anti-inflammatory properties of the ginger, along with the liver tonic properties of the dandelion flowers, liver and kidney tonic properties, as well as their antioxidants. So, it sounds good. Be worth a try. To my own palate, spicy and bitter sometimes makes the bitter taste more intense. So I don't always combine those two things, but I definitely think that it's something that you might want to try out and see what you think of it. All right. So yeah, brewing things with herbs is a very, it's not something that every herbalist out there is doing, but I think that over the last couple of decades, I've seen a lot more interest in wild fermentation, and I've seen a lot more interest in foraging and things like that. So combining the two of them together seems like a very likely thing to be a popular thing that people could be doing. So I expect to see more of it as time goes on, is what I'm trying to say. And think that all of you should get ahead of the trend and start trying that in your own practices. And the simplest things to brew into fermented beverages are fruit juices. You can hardly go wrong with them. They're actually much easier than roots and leaves and things like that. So if you have something like elderberry juice or tart cherry juice, and you just add a little bit of a starter to that and put it in the right kind of container, it will just ferment, pretty much effortlessly. And because Saccharomyces is just about the only thing that will live in that kind of environment, it's very likely that even if you didn't add a starter to it and you just put it in the vapor lock and let it go, that you would end up with the right bacteria in it, and the right yeast in it, and you would end up with the right kind of product. So yeah, fruit juices are very easy to ferment, and elderberry wine is a very traditional herbal remedy. Apple wine doesn't really have much medicinal properties to it, but it can be used to extract things if you weren't able to get distilled alcohol of any sort. It would be maybe the next best thing you could come by. And that's something that you could easily make yourself if you had to. So I think that brewing in general is a good kind of home ec type of skill that people should be able to do, and I think that learning to incorporate that with a practice of herbalism is a good thing to do as well. Okay, so one question was, did I say a gallon of water, a cup of sarsaparilla, and a cup of sassafras? I said a cup of sassafras and a half a cup of sarsaparilla, but you could do it the other way if you wanted to. These proportions aren't necessarily set in stone or anything. I like to use half as much sarsaparilla as sassafras when I'm making it. I feel like that's sufficient for what I want it to do, which is mostly give it more body and more foam. And then the other question I had there was, have I heard of using sourdough starter in lieu of yeast? I don't know that I've heard of that specifically. I've definitely heard of people using bread to try and get their reaction started, which I don't know that the bread really is going to contain much more yeast than anything else. A lot of the time fruit has yeast on the surface of it, and of course there's yeast in the air and stuff too. So a lot of it is, part of it is putting the yeast in it, part of it is just creating the right environment for the yeast to live in, because there's probably already some yeast present. But yeah, no, I haven't really heard of using sourdough starter, but I wouldn't be surprised if it worked just as well. It might, different yeasts produce different quantities of alcohol and different quantities of acids and things like that as they're fermenting. So you might get a little bit of a different flavor. Also, one way in which yeasts differ a lot from one another is in alcohol tolerance. At a certain level, at a certain strength, any yeast will die off from the alcohol and kind of stop producing so much. So for some yeasts, that amount is more like 5%, and for some of them, it's more like 12. So if you're using a yeast that only has an alcohol tolerance up to about 5%, it's basically impossible to get something that's has more than 5% alcohol in it. Whereas if you're using something that's more like 12%, you can get a 12% alcohol concentration if there's enough sugar for it to keep working on, to keep turning into alcohol, because that's what it does. It metabolizes the sugar and turns it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. And the carbon dioxide is the bubbles and the fizz, and also the pressure that shatters the jar if you put it in a sealed container. How do you preserve yeast from a previous batch to save for the next one? I don't really try to preserve them myself. There probably are techniques out there for preserving them, but I basically just, if I'm bottling one batch of stuff, there will be dregs at the bottom, and I will take some of those and add it to the next thing. When I'm done with one batch of stuff. If you let it sit too long, it'll get vinegary and you'll end up with something more like mother of vinegar. And then when you put it in the next thing, might turn it into vinegar. But if it's been fermenting up until the point, or up until shortly before you bottle it, and then you use that, that's usually how I do it. And so I just, go straight from brewing one thing to brewing the next thing. When the cider's done fermenting, I've got like a big 3-gallon and another one that's 5-gallon bottle that I do my fermenting in. So when I'm done using that bottle for one thing, I put the fermented product in jars or bottles, and then use the dregs from that as the starter for the next thing, or actually usually a small amount of the dregs from that, not all of them at all, but maybe like a cup of them or something like that. There's usually easily a quart of just thick yeasty dregs at the bottom. And so I use just a small amount of that to start the next batch. It starts faster if you buy yeast that's for that and add it, rather than starting with the dregs or the lees from the previous fermentation product. It usually will start faster if you get a commercial yeast, buy some, especially brewer's yeast, because brewer's yeast is more likely to have the alcohol tolerance and things like that compared to baker's yeast, but they're essentially the same stuff. And either one will produce alcohol given the chance to, just maybe not in the same quantities. So anyway, that's a little bit more of an involved and challenging project. If anybody feels up for doing some of that, trying some of that out, I would strongly encourage it. This weekend, I'm going to be doing an open house here. If anybody wants to come by, a couple of you have already come and visited the clinic and gotten to see it. I'm gonna gonna have a little bit of refreshments, gonna have some kind of mini classes, short classes about using herbs and things like that. So yeah, noon to 4 on Saturday, I'll be here and showing people the clinic. If anybody wants to come by and check it out, I will be here. And because pretty much everybody said they were interested or requested it, a lot of people were interested, I'm trying to come up with a workable curriculum for year 2 of this class, something that would be it might be not a 2-hour class once a week the way this year has been, but something to act as a good continuation of this course of study for people who want to. Yeah, and I hope that everyone who wants to will join in on that. And I still haven't quite figured out timing and pricing and things like that. So I'm still working on that part. Have a pretty good idea of what sort of information I want to impart to people and stuff like that, though. There's definitely, plenty of stuff out there to learn and to teach and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with those of you who choose to do that. All right. Any questions for today? on a second. I think, oh, where will the next plant walk be? I want to do one in Garrett County. I want to go back out to Garrett County where we went that other time and look at that area again. I think it would be very nice to see it this time of year, and I'm hoping to do that not this coming weekend, but one of the weekends shortly after that. Yeah, I think that it'll be a really good time to get out and see the early spring in the woods. So, that's where I want to do the next one. All right. Any other questions for today? I will try to get not only this, but the previous video uploaded tonight, since I did not get a chance to do them last week. I was planning on doing it Saturday, but my power was out from Saturday until last night, so had not had the chance to yet. All right, well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.